Welcome to Pursuing Quality Long-Term Care, an educational podcast for individuals needing long-term care and their families. Join us as we talk with national experts and advocates about strategies you can use in the pursuit of quality long-term care. Election season is an exciting time that offers a renewed opportunity to shape public policy. For many long-term care residents, voting is a patriotic duty that has been respected and exercised over the course of their lifetime. Residents of long-term care have the same right to vote as everyone else. Join us for a conversation with Gwen Orlowski, Executive Director of Disability Rights New Jersey, to discuss how residents and their families can ensure their voices are heard in the upcoming elections.
Hi, everyone. As we enter this election season and this presidential election year, the issue of voting keeps coming up. Today, we're going to be speaking with Gwen Orlowski, the Executive Director of Disability Rights New Jersey, about voting rights for people in long-term care and what it really means to vote as an older or disabled person, how the pandemic may or may not have impacted voting, what rights people have, what barriers they may face, and how they can advocate for themselves and others. Before we get started, we just want to note that voting rights do not change for people who live in long-term care. Long-term care consumers have the same rights as everyone else when it comes to voting, and there are specific accommodations and protections carved out for them. I also want to mention, and we can talk more about this as we have our conversation, that this is a population that takes the right to vote very seriously. Among the residents I've spoken with, voting is hugely important. It is something they take seriously and often will go to great lengths to advocate for themselves. And so, Gwen, just to start, again, people living in long-term care have the same right to vote as everyone else, but it's often harder for them. Can we just talk about like what we see happening with that, and maybe about what some protections that they have, particularly for people with disabilities?
I'd be happy to talk about that. I want to kind of dive in first to this question of the right of people who live in long-term care facilities to vote at all, right? Because there
Hmm.
could be this perception that people who are older or people with disabilities um, don't have the capacity to vote, don't
Right.
have the knowledge base to vote, simply because they're living in an institutional setting, then they can't necessarily get to the polls. They shouldn't vote or don't have the ability or the right to vote. And you began this way, and I think it's just so critically important to emphasize that. Absolutely, older adults and people with disabilities have the right to vote regardless of where they live, right? Whether they live in a long term care facility, a group home, a supported apartment, in their own homes,
Hmm.
wherever people are living. Um, they have a right to vote. Now, voting is very state specific, so there could be
Right.
limitations in some states. For example, in New Jersey, if you have a felony conviction and you're serving your prison, you're in prison, you're serving your term, you don't have a right to vote in that situation. Other people, by the way, who are jails and prisons might have the right to vote because they're not convicted of a felony.
Hmm.
Um, Similarly, uh, people who are subject to guardianship, at least in the state of New Jersey, retain the right to vote. And I think that there's a lot of misconception around
Yeah.
that. So if you're an older adult and you're a resident of a long-term care facility, even if there's a guardianship, you may retain the right to vote. So in New Jersey, the presumption is that the person does retain the right to vote. And again, very state specific.
Right.
But the guardianship order would have to have um, a clear finding that you were no longer able to vote because um, the test to be able to vote is really just that you're able to exercise a choice, right? You're able to understand that there are candidates and you're able to exercise your own choice. So for the most part, even people subject to guardianship can retain that right to vote. So I think that that is just such a key factor for people who are living in long-term care because
Yeah.
they're go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I'm really glad you brought that up because I do agree with that sort of misconception that people have, and when they think particularly of older adults, I think they have one perspective for people who are living on their own and a different perspective for people who might be living in long-term care. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's the same. I mean, people living in long-term care don't check their rights at the door. They have the same rights that everyone else in the community has. So I'm really glad that we're kind of starting with this because I think that's really important to put out there.
And I think the analog to that is people who have a different cognitive ability also retain the right to vote, right?
Right.
So people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, an older adult who may have some cognitive decline, that in and of itself is not a barrier, does not take away
Right.
somebody's right to vote. At least in New Jersey, it has to be by a court order with a specific finding regarding voting that is then embodied in the order itself. So, that's sort of, and we've seen that. Can I say, we run at
Yeah.
Disability Rights New Jersey. We have a hotline on voting day, and people who are in institutions, who are in some sort of residential setting, if they're having a problem with voting, for example, they're living in a nursing home and the nursing home social worker is saying, no, you can't vote, they can call us and then we'll intervene in those situations to ensure that people have the right to vote. Of course, the best course of action for people who are living in long-term care is to think about what their plan is ahead of
Right.
time, right? So that there aren't any barriers when they choose to exercise their right to vote. So, talking with the people in the long-term care facility who might be responsible for organizing a bus to go to the polling places is one example,
Right.
to make sure that those things are in place. I
Yeah,
would
I just want to
Sure.
interrupt again,
No, please
and say,
interrupt.
yeah, no, that I'm really glad that you brought up how state specific this is, because for people listening, I think that is really important. And it is important as you think about long-term care, it is important for family members to understand that every state is going to have different requirements. I mean, I think most people know that every state, although we should emphasize it, has different voting requirements in terms of when you ask for ballots and when, the timeline for voting and what that looks like and how you can vote. But I think it's important to understand that even when it comes to all of this, there's slightly different requirements for voting in every state that might differently impact different populations. So for people listening, like I think how you're describing it sounds great, and I would really urge everyone to reach out to their disability rights office in their state, to their ombudsman office if they run into problems, but it doesn't work quite the same way everywhere. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
And, I can't speak for other states, but we do
Right.
have a voting guide that's on our website. We do
Hmm.
it in conjunction with several other groups, and we was last updated in 2020. So there has been some changes, but it's basically, on target in terms of what people's rights are. So, I think that's also a good thing to do. For example, if you have a resident council or, again, an individual can do this, to reach out to your state long-term care ombudsman or your protection and advocacy organization. That's what Disability Rights New Jersey is. Many states it goes by Disability Rights New York, Disability
Hmm.
Rights California. Some states have slightly different names, but see if they have publications. So we at Disability Rights New Jersey have not only have the guide on our website, but we just printed hundreds and hundreds of copies, paper copies, and
Oh, that's
anybody who
great.
calls us will send them out, right? So that would be a great thing in, for residents councils to get copies if there are guides like that in your state so that people can read them and really be up to date on what their rights are. And then again, I can only speak for us, but all the protection and advocacies around the country, we get special federal funding to support voter education. So the other thing we can do is we can go out, right, and do. So we, for example, for the last, I don't know, 4 months or so, we do residence bingo in
Okay.
facilities.
Hmm.
Sometimes we do it with our long-term care ombudsman, sometimes on our own, but we've changed up that program in the last 4 months to include a voting component, right? So
Oh,
every
that's great.
residence bingo that we're doing has a voters' rights component so that people can really be empowered and know what their rights are. Can I turn for a second to an issue which I think goes to what are some of the barriers and then thinking through some of
Absolutely.
the solutions?
Yes.
So I think a historical barrier for people living in long-term care facilities has been to get to the poll on
Yes.
voting day. And I've been doing voting work for a long time, and in another manifestation of my career, one of the things that I would do was be in the polling places, but also assist in moving, helping people who were in nursing homes be able to go and vote on voting day. And that's back when we lived in a pretty restrictive, um, our ability to vote was really focused around getting to the polls on voting day.
Right.
So that is a barrier for people, especially people in long-term care, because you have to worry about whether or not you're feeling well that day, whether or not there's transportation. It's November, right? Like, why do we have election day in November? So there are weather events, you know, all those kinds of things that
Mhm.
can come into play. And so I think it's also important, this goes to being prepared, having a plan, to
Mhm.
look at your state's voting access processes, for the sake of something better to say, and think through which works best for you, right? So in New
Yeah.
Jersey, we have vote by mail. Um, Vote by mail is available to anybody for any reason. It's not like old-fashioned absentee voting where you had to have like a particular
Mhm.
reason. Though most people in a long-term care facility could always have voted on an absentee ballot in New Jersey as well. So, vote by mail is one way to think about how you're going to exercise your right to vote.
Right.
We have early voting in New Jersey. That can be beneficial as well, because maybe you have a family member and you have a weekly lunch that you do together or a visit, and you can look at how that could play out in the time of early voting and set up make a decision to go vote early and set up your plan, knowing that you could have a backup plan if that doesn't work out.
Right.
And then if you're going to do it on election day, again, talking through with either a family member or a friend who's going to help you, or with the facility, to see if they're
Right.
going to facilitate transportation to the polling places. So I think thinking about all of those ways of voting, knowing what they are ahead of time, and having a plan is just so
Right.
important.
Well, and I really want to piggyback on that, on the idea of having the plan, because I think you're right. And again, it's important to recognize that every state does this a little bit differently, and different states, will have different requirements, different deadlines, especially with absentee and things like that. But in residents I've spoken to, one of their biggest issues has been getting their absentee ballot request forms, getting what they need from their facility in a timely fashion, or in a time period in which they're comfortable. So we have one resident this year, for instance, who has been asking and asking and asking her activities director for those absentee ballot request forms. She finally was able to get them on her own, for herself, but that, they're still waiting for other people in the facility. And we have another resident who a few years ago reached out to us because he didn't get his forms in time, and in the end he reached out to his local ombudsman program, and he was able to physically get to the polls, which was difficult for him and had never been his initial plan. But he was able to get there. But the rest of the facility, I'm not sure how if they voted. And so I think one thing for this population that can be so difficult for people living in long-term care is, like, sometimes you feel this, you don't have the same level of control that other people have over lots of aspects in your life, but this is one place where we see that. And so I think, to your point earlier, having that plan and having sort of an outline of what you need to know and what your facility should be providing to you is really important, because it's not that facilities, I think, are intentionally keeping people from getting their ballots, but there's a lot going on, and a lot of facilities don't have a lot of staff. And so it isn't the highest priority when call bells are going off to make sure that all of this, even though it should be a high priority. So I
And
just,
I think that speaks to why this is important to be thinking about in July, even though the
exactly.
election isn't
Yes.
until November. So, we kind of skipped over, but, first you have to be registered, right?
Right.
And my
Exactly.
guess is that this is a population that a lot of people are already registered, but again, need to check your registration. And especially if you've moved into the facility
Yes.
recently, at least, again, it's state specific, but a change in address can trigger certain things, right? And so, here
Exactly.
in New Jersey, if you've moved within the last 30 days, then you vote at your previous, and you're going to vote in person. You vote at your previous polling station, not the one that would serve the long-term care facility. So there are all those kind of intricate
Right.
rules that you have to think about if your address has changed. Assuming somebody's registered, their address hasn't changed, that's not part of this planning equation right now. I want to say about getting the vote by mail. Again, in New Jersey, we have a methodology. It's in our voter handbook. Every state has their own. But the earlier that you do that, so that you have a confidence level, and in New Jersey, you can do it by requesting it by telephone. There's an online form. So you can either fill it out online or you can get it mailed to you by calling and fill it out and complete it. I guess you have to always print it out and then send it in. But you don't want to wait until October to do that, right? Because that is going to be
Right.
anxiety provoking. You want to do it now, July or August, early September, so that you know that you're registered to vote by mail ahead of time. And then you said something else that I think is really important to tell people, at least in New Jersey, but I think this is probably true everywhere, that if you request a vote by mail ballot, but for some reason you don't end up voting by mail, right? Maybe you didn't get
Mhm.
it, maybe you lost it. When you vote by mail, you have to follow the instructions very, very particularly, right? You
Right.
make a mistake, so the ballot is no longer valid. Um, you still have a right to vote on the machine, either during early voting or on election day. I shouldn't say vote on the machine. You have a right to vote in person.
Right.
It typically what would happen is you would do what's called a provisional ballot. You do a paper ballot that day. And the reason is they have to double check. You can only vote once, right? So they just have to make sure your paper ballot was not mailed in. And then if
Right.
it was not mailed in, they'll count the other ballot. But I think the main point I'm trying to get out is just because you requested a mail-in ballot or an absentee ballot, if for some reason you don't do it, you can still go to your polling place on voting day and you can still vote.
Right. It's interesting. So I live in DC and I've lived there for about 6 years. So now I'm trying to remember if this was true before COVID, if I was registered when I registered to vote in DC. Um, but we receive mail-in ballots in the mail. They come to us. In They just come, and this started during the pandemic, but that it just brings up something else I want to talk about, which is sort of how the pandemic has affected things for people in long-term care, and how it's had maybe benefits in terms of maybe more states moving to mail-in voting or giving other options, and then maybe some of the consequences of the pandemic, because I know in some facilities used to be polling places. And we see that, I think, less. I talked to one resident who said, before the pandemic, her facility was a polling place. It is no longer a polling place. She
Mm.
doesn't blame the pandemic. She thinks there are different reasons why that might have happened. But I think it is important to sort of think about those things too, like what has changed and what is different, and what may have worked a few years ago might look different for you in 2024. Um,
And to your point about just getting your mail-in ballots, we in New Jersey just got them during the pandemic as well, but that has stopped. We
it
have to
stopped.
request them now. So again, I think
It's
things
very state.
change and you really need to investigate it a little bit ahead of time to make sure you know what's going on currently.
Right. And I do think that's really important for residents. It's really important for families. And it sort of comes back to the residents I've spoken to who are sort of gunning for those ballots now, and they are making the right decision, because it's really a situation where you can't just sit by and wait and hope that the facility provides you with everything you need, because they may, and they should, and absolutely, like, it is part of their responsibility to ensure that this works for you, but it helps and will make things smoother, as you pointed out earlier, if you are paying attention to what some of these deadlines are. So
And
yeah.
again, it might be a good subject for a resident council or a family council
Yes.
in August to have this conversation. And so, they're united and then and then they can seek the assistance that they need from the staff of the long-term care facility.
Right.
Um, I wanted to touch on something else you mentioned at the very beginning, which I think had to do with like checking signatures,
Hmm.
right? And how that can be difficult for people in long-term care facilities. Um, and I think about my mom who died about a year and a half ago. She was here, lived with us actually for the last 20 years. She helped raise my children. So she wasn't in a long-term care facility, but her signature changed a lot, right? And I think
Yeah.
going to your point about things that changed during COVID, it changed a lot during COVID. She did do some voting by mail, but as the pandemic moved on, my mom was just one of those people who wanted to vote in person, right? Like it was
Yeah.
this part of who she was and her civic duty. I think she liked going to the polling place. I think she liked voting on the machine. So a couple things about that. One, her signature had changed significantly. They did not challenge her on it, right? So when you go in and you sign the book,
Hmm.
it did not match her previous signature. They did not challenge her on it, but somebody might get challenged on it. And so one thing to know is if your signature has changed a lot, you can always, before the election, go to your board of elections or whatever the process is in your state, and you can sign a new signature card so that your signature will be your current. Maybe you sign your signature card when you were 55 and now you're 80, right? And you have a different signature. So
Right.
you can do that. Also, the signature doesn't have to be anything specific, right? It's just your mark. Nobody can force you to put every single letter of your name into your signature. It's your mark. So for some people who might have had a change in their signature over time, and maybe their signature is a simpler signature now than it used to be, again, you can go and do that ahead of time. Here in New Jersey, we were having a lot of problems with people who were being challenged on their signature. And so we actually have a process now and they were being voting on the provisional ballots. We have a process now where you can fix that post-election, so that your ballot is being counted. I don't know if that exists in every
Every
state, but
state.
that's a fairly recent change in New Jersey. So it's really, that's another thing that's important to know, that you
Yeah.
don't have to have the same signature. If you can, change it ahead of time. You don't even have to sign in a way that looks like a traditional signature. It can really just be your mark. Um, and then I just want to say something about voting on the machine. I'm going back to the story of my mom. Um, the last time she voted, which was November of 22. She died in
Hmm.
February of 23. So I'm very proud of the fact that my mom was still exercising that right to vote as long as she
That's
possibly could,
awesome.
well into her 90s. So that was great. But that last time, she needed my assistance, right? She had difficulty seeing, she had difficulty pushing the buttons. So it's important to know that you can have a supporter help you
Hmm.
vote. It can't be your employer in New Jersey. It can't be a union member in New Jersey. And if you don't have somebody that you've come to the polls with to help you vote, like a family member or a friend, the people in the polling place can help you vote as well. They have to have, at least here in New Jersey, one person from each party, a Democrat and Republican, go in to ensure that there's no
Hmm.
undue influence. And then you can also, every polling place has to have an accessible machine. And so you can
Right.
also ask to vote on the accessible machine. For example, you might need certain things in braille, or you might need voice to text, that kind of thing. So all of those things should be available at the polling place should you decide to exercise your right to vote in person on election day or through early voting.
Right. And it's funny when you started talking about your mom's story, I am reminded, and it did not turn out as well, but years ago, my grandfather passed away in 1992, and he passed away in mid-November, but after election day, I mean, and also it was 1992. I don't know what the rules were around absentee voting and all of those things at the time. But I remember my grandmother drove him to the polls and he felt too sick and he didn't make it in. So he didn't vote, which, maybe that could have gone differently if they had pushed. But at the end of the day, what I took from that growing up was that he wanted to vote that badly. That he was, and I think this is something going back to what we were talking about earlier, that when you talk about people, and not just of a specific generation, but people for all sorts of reasons, when you talk about people who are living in long-term care, their desire to vote, the reasons they have for voting are often very personal and very deeply important to them. I talked to a resident who has said that, as an African American, it is so important to him that he continue to vote because he knows what his family members went through. And I talked to a woman whose family came from Eastern Europe and how in her family it was so important. And these aren't people who are in their 80s and 90s. These are people a little bit younger than that, but they still, so when we talk about the idea that I think there is this conception that for people in long-term care, this isn't as important, maybe, that can often be hugely wrong because I think these are often the people for whom this is very important. I mean, this is one of the most important things they can do. And it is also a way for them to have some control over something. In a life when you live in long-term care, often you don't have that control. Being able to take part in this really matters. So your
I
mom's story
could,
just made me think of that because,
yeah, I could not agree more with all of that.
yeah.
So,
The other thing I wanted to just talk a little bit about, because I feel like something I said earlier, I don't want to correct, but I want to make sure is very clear that while residents and families should really be paying a lot of attention to this, I don't want to take responsibility away from facilities. And certainly there are a lot of things that facilities can and should be doing to help with all of this. So I'd like to just kind of talk about that a little bit, like what sort of best practices and what things should ideally look like when you're voting. Because yes, it is for you as a resident or as a family member of someone in long-term care, it is important to have a plan and to know what questions to ask your facility, but there are also things that the facilities should ideally just be doing. And so can we talk a little bit about that?
well, I think, one of the things that they should and could be doing is having voter registration forms easily available and vote by mail or absentee ballot, whatever that
Right.
process is in the state, right? Like, so they themselves can have those forms readily available, maybe, during events, have a table set up that has those forms available. I think even reaching out to their long-term care ombudsman or their protection and advocacy and saying, "Hey, do you have somebody who can come do an outreach on voting?" As I said,
Yes.
I know we would, any facility that called us and said, "Hey, can you come do an outreach on voting?" We would be there, in a second. We would do that. So, um, and so then there's that opportunity to really make it easily available for people both to register to vote and if they choose to vote by mail to do that. Similarly, when vote by mail forms show up, when the actual ballot shows up, having somebody sit with the resident and,
Yeah.
read the instructions, go through it, make sure everybody understands to the extent that something about the ballot requires dexterity. And by the way, this is an issue we are trying to get electronic virtual voting in New Jersey because for some people, the
Yeah,
ballot
absolutely.
themselves can or filling out the ballot, for example, for people who are sight impaired and other things. So, I think we still have a long way to go to make really accessible voting and accessible ballots in this country. But again, having somebody from the facility the facility can teach their own staff, here's what the ballot looks like, get them familiar so then they can help residents. If people have dexterity problems, helping them with some of the, tear on this line, fold
Hmm.
exactly this way kind of thing. So that those parts of the mail-in ballot go well, because again, everything has to be just so.
Right.
Ultimately making sure that the ballots get mailed. Um, and then, I already mentioned transporting people to the
Hmm.
polls on election day. But really thinking if you have early voting in your state, how can you facilitate that ahead of time, right?
Right.
That tends not to be the regular polling place. There are special places for early voting, special voting sites. You know, facilitating several visits to them ahead of time so that people who want to vote early can vote early. And again, maximizing the opportunities for people to vote would also be some
Right.
of the other things that I think would be really best practices.
Yeah, so something else that residents mentioned to me, which is part of this, which is less to do with the technical voting, but is providing information on the issues and the candidates and inviting candidates to come to the polling places. And I know I many years ago worked on a political campaign in a small state, and we campaign staff and often with the candidate would go to nursing homes and senior living homes, and we would bring ice cream for everyone, we would talk to the people who live there. But I think when, again, we think about nursing homes and long-term care facilities as people's homes and as community for them, it is important to recognize that it isn't as simple sometimes as just handing someone a ballot. I mean, they do need more information. So that goes back, you've talked a lot about how the resident councils can participate, but I think getting, and this maybe pushes it a little bit back to residents, but residents can do that by working with a resident council to see if they can invite people, but facilities could be reaching out to hold events like that too, where candidates come in, where people come in to speak to different issues, and maybe in those resident council meetings residents can discuss some of the issues that are going to be on the ballot. Because I know for myself, for somebody who's been to law school and who has worked on campaigns and done policy work all my life, sometimes you look at the back of your ballot and you're like, wait a minute, like what are these issues about?
Yes.
And
Public questions. Yes.
yeah, and so it's like,
Yeah.
wait, and again, because voting is so important to many people in long-term care, they want to know what they're voting for. They want to know what these issues really represent. So,
So I do know that our national organization and the National Disability Rights Network, NDRN, is organizing with protection and advocacy candidate forums.
mm,
So again, your state protection and advocacy can be a resource because there may be some candidate forums going on in some of the states. And so by way of example, if there's a webinar with a candidate
right.
forum or there's some sort of YouTube or whatever, maybe the facility can set up a viewing so that
Yeah.
residents can participate and listen, and that whole process help facilitate like when questions that can be a little bit I find it at least a little bit complicated when you're on a public webinar, public
Yes.
town hall, and when can you star three, whatever it is. Now
Mhm.
you can unmute yourself, right? And you can talk, but helping the facility can help facilitate some of that if there's a group presentation so people can listen to candidate forums. Um,
Yeah, I was thinking that is, as I was saying it, and then when you started talking, like this is another area where whether it's the pandemic or just advancing technology that has moved so much online,
yeah,
that there are so many places that people can go, and having just, again, resources listed or available or making suggestions to people is hugely helpful in terms of residents kind of seeking out information.
absolutely. I know this week I was on a town hall with one of our congressmen, Congressman Kim. He does them regularly. I was talking about the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act,
Hmm.
but I can well imagine also that some candidates may have that kind of forum, and it would, encourage you can listen to them, and you can, when you're allowed to unmute yourself and ask a question.